Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Hope you're having a fantastic day. So what are we doing today? Well, as this title says, I'm going to improve the ride quality of the KRX. And for those of you who own a KRX, well, how can you do that? Well, it's a couple of ways and we're going to get into it. So first of all, how does the KRX ride? Well, the KRX rides fantastic straight out of the box. You know, I came from a Pioneer, so you're talking 8 inches of wheel travel to quite a bit more in the front and rear of this thing. And the shock technology has come leaps and bounds from where it used to be. So the KRX comes with a factory Fox shock, which is right down here, the easiest one to get to. Now on this shock, you have 2 springs. You have your tender spring and you have your main spring. I could be messing these up. And then you also have a compression adjustment right here. So if you click it right here clockwise, see if you can hear the click. Very faint. It will stiffen up the compression on the shock. These don't have a rebound, just the compression. After about the first 100 to 125 miles, the KRX was really sagging. It was losing ground height. And the reason being is these tender springs right here, well, the stock ones just started to fail. I mean, they were no good. I put these on. These are all things UTV tender springs, super easy to put on yourself, and greatly improved the ride and the handling. Well, depending on who you talk to, you have to maintain your shocks. You're supposed to rebuild them every 2 years, 2,000 miles, according to one company, and some are even longer. So what does a rebuild look like? Well, a rebuild looks like taking these things apart, replacing the seals, replacing the oil, and then recharging them with nitrogen. So how do you recharge it with nitrogen? Aftermarket ways? Well, there's a couple ways. One, you can get a new cap with a Schrader valve, or 2, you can drill the cap that's on here, and that's what's going to happen with mine. Drill and tap it to put a Schrader valve in, and that is going to go right there. That's where they're going to drill and tap it for the Schrader valve to charge this with nitrogen, so I'll have oil and a nitrogen charge. So that's your typical rebuild. So I'm ready for a rebuild. And the reason I say that is, I don't know if you could hear the clicks. It was very faint. I'm hooking up the camera close enough, it will show them. But when you don't have a really positive click, that can mean signs of your nitrogen is leaking out. And just like car tires, your nitrogen is eventually going to leak out. That's why people will put the Schrader valves on, and you can adjust that nitrogen pressure to actually adjust how your shock performs. Now within the shock, there's quite a bit going on there. There's little shims, and when you adjust the compression, it adjusts the shims and how fast the oil will flow through your shock. I am not a shock expert, so I will not get any farther into that. So the last just shy of 2,000 miles, this thing has run great. The problem is now I got a lot of body roll. They're not as stiff as I want them. And the other problem is when I go all the way soft to all the way firm on the compression setting, I really can't tell a difference. And what am I going to have done, and where am I taking it? Well, I'm taking it down to shock therapy. I'm very fortunate that they're only about 30 minutes from my house, depending on traffic, maybe 45. And what are they going to do to my machine? Well, we're going to go ahead. I'm going to get a full rebuild, but I'm going to take it to the next step. I'm going to have them go ahead and put new springs on it, and I'm going to have them revalve it. And we'll talk about that and what that means. So there's different levels that you can do for your machine and these shocks. First of all, you just have them rebuilt. It puts them right back to the factory settings, just the way it came off the showroom floor. If anything's damaged or broken, they'll go ahead and fix that. The next most popular option is to respring it. Now, if you respring it, that's like playing 50 questions with shock therapy. They're going to ask you everything to get your weights correctly and how you drive it. Everything like, do you have a back bumper? Do you have a tailgate? Do you have a pack out system? Do you carry a cooler? Are you running a winch and skid plates, aftermarket cages? There's all kinds of stuff, down to what is your driving style. Now make sure you ask questions like that, because my people I ride with out here in the valley say I'm an aggressive driver, but the people I go with in Moab says I'm a very cautious driver. According to shock therapy, I'm a normal driver. It's just the type of riding I like to do. So they're going to go ahead and they're going to set this up with the springs and the information that I gave them and what I like to do, whether it's racing, fast desert, woods, rock crawling, whatever. The next step I'm gonna have them do is I'm gonna have them re-valve it. So what does that mean? Well, that means they're taking it apart to rebuild it. Those shims I was talking about that lets the oil go through on all that good magical stuff, they're gonna do their special sauce. And that's really where you're gonna feel your ride improvement. It's not just the springs. The springs are only 50% of it. The revalving is the other 50%. Now there's a couple ways you can do this with shock therapy. I can go ahead and take everything off and I can drive it down there. I can mail it to them. They have 2 different sites and they will rebuild it and send it back. Or I can go down and pick it up. Or like I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take my whole machine down there and they're going to rebuild it and set the machine up for me. Put it back to the appropriate ride height so I can get the best use of travel for the front and rear shocks. So they'll take my tire size into account and do whatever they do, because the suspension stuff is definitely not my specialty. So the only thing I have left to do, get this on the trailer, strapped down, and get it up the road to shock therapy. Now, nice thing with them is you drop it off at 7:30 that morning, you pick it up at 4:30 that afternoon. So let's go ahead, let me get this thing cleaned out. I got the cover and helmets on the seats and everything. Get this hooked up on the trailer. Just like that, it's loaded. Let's go ahead and get down to shock therapy. So as you noticed, everyone straps down a different way. I kind of do overkill. I go wheel loops here on all 4 tires. I don't like to compress the suspension if I don't have to. Let's get in and get moving. Well, she's all done. I didn't get any video dropping it off. I was running a little late because of traffic. It's on the trailer. Can't do too much now, but it looks good. So the front springs here, front shocks, had around 50 PSI of nitrogen in them. He said that was low. The rear back here, 0, which I had a feeling there wasn't gonna be much on there, but they look good, they're shiny. I've got my Go Fast shock therapy stickers there. Those are good for like 8 horsepower a piece. And then here's what I mean with the nitrogen caps. And then they did their silencer crossover rings. And then of course, like every shock therapy, they give you your koozie. So it's hot, it's about 102 degrees. Gonna hit rush hour traffic, so let's get home and get this thing unloaded and let's play around the neighborhood a little bit. So I'm back at the house and it's been about 10 days since I picked up the KRX. Yes, 10 days, that is 2 weekends. As you can see, I have finally washed my face and got all that dirt off. So what have I learned? Well, honestly, I haven't learned much. The last 2 weekends I tried to go riding, it's just been too hot. It's still well over 100 degrees here. So what have I learned? Well, driving it around the neighborhood, I got just over 10 miles on it. It is a much firmer and more controlled ride. That's about the only way I can describe it. Now, what do I mean by that? When I dropped this thing off, as I just said, there was really no nitrogen in it. The front had 0, the rear had about 50 PSI. So now that it's properly charged, there's some big differences. When shock therapy gave me this back, it was set on the softest setting that they had. And the softest setting here is much more controlled in the body roll aspect when I go back and forth, solid the wheel, because it still rolls, but not nearly as much. As part of like the valving and how everything works, well, I can't really go off of that because I don't have enough miles. But there are some other changes. Let's talk about some of these changes. So if you look right there, see the front tires, they're slightly cambered in, just like they came from the factory. But when I took this to shock therapy, they were much, much more cambered in. And that was from the front springs sagging. So I got my little notebook here, and what were they before and after? Well, before, they were 14.5 inches on ground clearance. Now that's from the very bottom center of the skid plate down to the ground. Currently, it's sitting at 16 7/8 of an inch. Now that's today's measurement after about 10 days, about 10 miles. I do expect that to sag just a little bit more. But more importantly, what is the angle of the front axle? Well, it's 15 degrees. Now I have the Super ATV Rhino 2.0 axles on the front of this, stock axles on the rear. So 15 degrees is pretty good. Now I'm running 9 pounds of pressure on the front tires, so not too bad. Let's talk about the springs real quick on the front. Now you can kind of decode the springs from what I've read online on looking at the serial number. So right there is a shock therapy spring with my serial number. But what I've been told, if you take these first 3 digits, invert them, that's the poundage. So I have a 250/350 spring on the front of my vehicle. Now how does that translate? Honestly, I'm not a shock guy. It's something with the spring rates and how it compresses, because on the rear, it's a 200/200, but let's go back there and talk about the rear. So with the rear being a 200/200, that works a little bit differently than the front. I would have thought the rears would have been a heavier duty spring, but apparently the way the shock geometry works with your suspension and all that stuff, it's the way it needs to be. So Shock Therapy is the experts, that's who I'm going with. Now, the ground clearance on the rear from my skid plate, I went from 17 inches before to 18 1/8 afterwards. So I got some ground clearance back there. So now for the angle on the rear axle is between 17 and 18 degrees. So when these springs settle just a little bit, it'll probably be a little bit better. But again, that's not a real aggressive angle in my point of view. Forgot to mention my rear tire pressure back there is around 12 PSI as it's currently set up for the woods up north in Arizona. When I go to Moab, I will drop the pressures down much lower so the tires have a little bit more bite on the rocks. This will be my 3rd trip to Moab with these tires. It's probably gonna wear them out or pretty close to. They're about 60% worn because it's just like driving on sandpaper out there. So Shock Therapy, super nice, polite, professional people. I dropped my machine off right before 8 a.m. They called me about 1 p.m., said everything was good to go and ready for pickup. Super fast service. I understand why everyone likes to go to them. So hopefully I can get my videos back out on a normal basis now with the heat starting to cool down. I can get some real riding time on this. I know the next video we have some more upgrades for the KRX. I've been neglecting it lately, but I got a little bit more armor to put on there before we get ready to go to Moab here next month. So don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and until next time.